Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
Hey Pavan, do you want to play a game of word associations?
Sure, bring it on.
Alright, what do you think when I say China?
Doklam,
Pyjama-Laadi, Mumbai,
floods,
Assam,
floods,
Nepal,
floods,
Bangladesh.
floods.
I am sensing a pattern here, Pavan. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast. I'm Hamsini Hariharan.
And I'm Pavan Srinath.
And every week we talk about policy, politics and economics on the show.
This episode is dedicated to our producer Abbas Momin and his valiant efforts to get back into the studio after braving Mumbai's floods to produce our show.
So in the first half, we'll be talking about urban flooding. And we have a new segment this week called Cheat Sheet, where we look at how people rob us of public money.
Yes, how they ensure that our money flows into the wrong drains.
And in the second half, we'll be talking to Alka Acharya about where we need to change the way we think about our neighbor China. Houston, Mumbai, Assam, Nepal, Bangladesh, parts of the world seem to be flooding over the last 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about floods in this episode today, but more specifically about urban floods. Pavan, who do we blame for this flooding that we're seeing?
So usually climate change is on top of people's minds whenever you see great deluges, cities flooding and so on. But I want climate change to be the last thing we think of. Now, large-scale rural flooding is a little different from urban flooding and has different reasons as well. A lot of the times when, say, Bihar or Assam flood, it's because the river swells over, sometimes the dams let go of their water and so on. So that's a different beast altogether. So if we talk mostly about city flooding, the single underlying thing in this is the drain. The simple stormwater drain outside your house. That's your one-stop solution to flooding. And they don't work in most cities. And this is because drains are one of those things which, if they're working well, you should not notice. Well, frankly, that's the way all our public services should be. But, every time you go by a good road in India, you take notice of it, right? But you don't take notice of, oh, wow, the drain is working really well. No, you don't see it working most of the time.
Well, nice roads make for good Instagram pictures. Drains, on the other hand, don't.
Fair enough. But if you're driving, you will obviously enjoy it. So drains are literally invisible. They're the last priority in a lot of urban infrastructure. People want their roads, people want water, electricity, and drains come last. So that's the first problem. So when you have a limited amount of money that's going into our cities to begin with, and a limited amount of quality in the infrastructure that's being constructed, drains take the worst hit. So the problem starts over there.
All right, but that's because we don't notice it, right? I mean, we don't notice the problem until the city floods, until climate change hits us in the face. Maybe we don't notice that the problem exists.
True, but our minds are also so distorted. In Bangalore, you can see these great nalas. They're called the Rajakaluways. I mean, they have a grand name, right? They're the kingly canals. And they're filled with sewage and flowing down all the time. The first thing is a stormwater drain at regular times when it's not raining should be empty.
Empty?
Yes. So they should be just vacant. And only when flood waters come or storm waters come should they be full.
Okay, this is counterintuitive. How exactly does a drain work in that sense?
So the first thing is, this is fairly simple but still escapes a lot of people, is that your drain is supposed to only carry storm water and you have a separate underground pipe for your sewerage. So that's unfortunately called underground drainage, and this is called stormwater drainage.
All right.
Okay, so your sewage is supposed to go in this big fat pipe direct to your sewage treatment plant or any collection center, and then should be treated and then probably let into a lake or into the stormwater drain. The stormwater drains is just a network of things connected to your roads which collects water when it falls on the earth's surface.
All right.
Okay, the problem in Indian cities is that the two are often mixed. As in, they are separate, but they can be interlinked, they can be leakages, so they're not fully separated. So it's like you might have an underground pipe collecting sewerage from your toilets and so on, but eventually they might just open up into a nala. Right?
Okay.
So that's what happens in India. So that's the first problem that needs to be fixed. Right?
Okay.
So what happens in Indian cities is your nalas or your stormwater drains are already carrying a lot of liquid. So when floodwaters come, they come on top of that. So in fact, some of the times this happened close to where I'm living right now, the two sets of waters together can be higher than the height of the smaller inlets leading in, which results in backflow. So even places which are not independently flooding can get flooded by the sewerage water. And obviously this water is nastier, which is why the cost of urban flooding is not just the infrastructure damage, but also the immense health risk that it poses. Leptospirosis and a lot of other nasty ailments are very common and can be very easily picked up by this. For example, if a basement floods and you want to pick up your bike and take it out later, there's a good chance that you will be catching something when you're doing that.
All right. So the problem between drainage and sewage is important, but I'm sure there are like surveys and stuff that's done to figure out the state of our city's infrastructure.
So that's the thing, right? So infrastructure is hidden. Sometimes the government doesn't always help you with what the state is. So you can at least go and ask people. So people have been doing this in Bangalore and in India for a long time, taking good market feedback and research on public services. But, for example, in Kannada, there is not one word for a drain, but two. There's something called a mori and something called a charandi.
Okay.
And something bigger than that are called a kaluve or a canal. And mapping these to your sewerage and your stormwater drains is a big problem for most people. So when, say, you go and ask a survey, a question as to whether your drain is working properly, people don't know what the intended use of that drain is supposed to be. In some places where you don't have sewerage lines, people have septic tanks of their own. So the idea is things from your toilet go to the septic tank, but say your kitchen water or other water goes into the actual drain, the stormwater drain. So in some places, that's the official use. And in some other places, it's reserved purely for stormwater. So I know of people who have dropped questions on drainage from their questionnaires because they can't get intelligent answers anymore. So that's how bad it is. We don't even know how bad our drainage systems really are. We just come to know a little bit of it when things start flooding.
So starting point is there. I mean, figuring out the state of our drains, but you're saying even that is problematic.
Yes. And here, you have your local governments, national governments, the courts. Pretty much no one comes off very good in this scenario. Even the courts have just made life more complicated. Because encroachment over these canals and the drainage system is one big pervasive problem in all our cities. The Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom decided one day that you shall not ever cover any part of the stormwater drain. So imagine you have, say, a flyover. Okay. And you have a lot of road traffic, you have maybe pedestrian traffic, and you have a drain running below. You cannot cover that drain to prevent solid waste from falling on it. Okay. So it's natural that any deep underlying area, people will chuck garbage at it, right? So it makes sense to cover it.
That sounds absurd on so many levels.
But the Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom decided that if you allow people to cover any part of the drain, then the encroachment on it will increase. Okay, so we have these kinds of one-size-fits-all diktats coming from various places which just make life more complicated rather than less. I think there were more sensible solutions to preventing encroachment, for example.
I'm sure.
So you have all of this happening. And in all this, the tragedy is climate change and issues like that actually hijack the discourse rather than contribute to it. I mean, you'd think that, if climate-related issues are getting worse, then drainage should get more importance.
Yeah.
But what happens instead is, instead of people just fixing the drain outside their house because they should, they start talking about, carbon emissions and climate adaptation and what is India's role in all this. Who should pay for India to fix its drains and all these kinds of ridiculous conversations, which really take us nowhere.
So wait, so you're saying the problem isn't climate change at all?
I'm saying in India, we are not there yet. For example, Bangalore has 1 to 2 days a year when we got 100 millimeters of rainfall. This happens year on year. Mumbai has at least a few days where it gets about 200 millimeters and several days when it gets over 100 millimeters.
Yeah.
Cities do get flooded. Some houses get flooded. You have property laws and a few people die. This happens year on year. You don't need climate change to explain any of this. This is just the natural climate of those areas. Okay, so whatever climate change is doing is above and beyond that. Right? And for what it's worth, we do know that because of climate change, the number of intense weather events is going up. There's literature from India suggesting the same. In the US, what you have seen is people talk about things like a 30-year flood or a 100-year flood. That means, the probability. So just like I said, that you get 1 or 2 days of 100 millimeters rainfall in a year in Bangalore. You get one such flood every 30 years on rough probability. Right? So people have identified, what a 30-year flood threshold is or a 1,000-year threshold is and so on. And one of the things that's noticed is what was a 1,000-year flood happened twice in, say, 10 years. Right? So things that were improbably high happened more frequently than people imagined. Right? So you have influences like that coming in from climate change. But by and large, it's still an urban infrastructure basics issue right now. Let's fix it. I mean, if Bangalore gets an unanticipated flood, then let's, think about it. I'd rather, fix the basic problem first. You're right. I mean, no matter what we do, experiencing, say, the Mumbai 2005 rains, I mean, that was a big deal. It was 1 meter of rain that fell over the city in 3 days.
Or even the Chennai rains last year.
Yeah, but Chennai rains was different, right? It was not just the rain, but, reservoirs being flooded, the design being bad, water being scooped up in one area. So Chennai was definitely a failure of urban infrastructure. The Mumbai 2005 floods, I mean, you can call that an act of God here. But something that happens year on year, I wouldn't elevate it to that level.
All right. So you're saying it's about making cities just adaptable to the effects of urbanism?
Even that is too complicated. I mean, we have roads, waterfalls, we need drains. I mean, the moment you go from farm area to built area, if you have just mud can take in a lot of the water. So the moment you have a hard surface, you need a drain to take it somewhere else. And it's just a basic part of urban infrastructure.
All right. If it's as simple as that, then the solutions should also be simple, right? I mean, we see a lot of people doing rainwater harvesting and things like that.
So rainwater harvesting is good in that you are capturing the rain at home and not contributing to all the mess that's there in the nalas. That's a good thing. But the problem is interesting. Our cities are these things where we artificially import tons of water from wherever the source is and bring it to the city. The moment you bring water in, either we drink it and consume it, or it leaks. And eventually, and the sewer pipes leak. So eventually, a lot of extra water actually goes into the city's water table. So what you can actually see in Bangalore, this is very evident. Outskirts of Bangalore are completely dry, the soil. People go 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet to find water. But in the middle of the city, the water table is actually oversaturated. There's actually water logging. I mean, like our office areas and, many parts of central Bangalore, the topsoil is actually flooded with water. And it's dirty water.
Yeah.
And so if you do rainwater harvesting there and let water into the soil, you're not actually helping. Okay, so rainwater harvesting is again good, but not a blanket solution. Many people want a one-shot blanket solution which will fix it. But no, this is like plumbing, right? You have to get the plumbing right. There is no magical solution to this. But over there, even though a lot of money has been poured, it's still gone down the drain.
Okay, so what is the government doing about it? Like how much money has been put into drainage then?
A lot of money. For example, between 2005 and 10, Bangalore might have spent 400 or more crores on our stormwater drains, probably a similar amount thereafter.
Okay.
But this has involved a lot of scams.
Scams, you said. All right. So speaking of scams, we are doing a new segment every second week called the Cheat Sheet, where we look at how people have gotten extraordinarily clever in robbing people of public money. On this segment, we're going to be decoding what policies and how economics worked with respect to various scams that have taken over the country through time. Going back to drains, Pavan, what is the scam with drainage?
Okay, so I know that drainage is boring, but I think you will find this interesting. This is called the Pyjama-Laadi scam. The Pyjama-Laadi scam. Yes, you heard that right.
I'm still processing this, all right?
Now, suppose that I am the government of Bangalore, right? I'm sitting in the municipality.
Okay.
And I want to buy 100 pyjamas and 100 ladis or ladas, right? The string that you use to tie the pyjamas together.
Yeah.
So, if I'm the government and I need to buy this, I need to float a tender. I need to say, look, I want to buy 100 pyjamas and ladis. I'll mention all the specifications and I'll ask for quotes. So now, let's assume that the lowest quote or the set rate comes to say $100 for each pajama and $10 for each ladi.
All right.
Okay, so together the tender is worth 11,000 rupees. Okay.
Sure.
So what happens is, supposing the contractor is my good friend Amit Verma, and Amit and I know each other and try to help each other out. So what we'll do is, in the last minute of the tender specifications, when all the bids are coming in, we rig the tender a little bit. So instead of 110, we say that every ladi will cost 95 rupees. Okay?
All right.
And every pajama will just cost $10 as per the tender document. Okay. And we fix this in the last minute. So they add up to 10,500 rupees for 100 pieces. So we have come below the specification. It's a good lowest tender. We sign the deal. He gets the contract. Okay. Now, what Amit does is he promptly delivers all the ladis.
Okay.
100 ladis arrive very quickly. As far as I'm concerned, out of 10,500 rupees, we've already got goods worth 9,000 rupees. Okay. So we happily sign a utilization certificate saying this much financial resources have been suitably utilized. And so since that is done, Amit gets most of the money, right? Everything but the last installment of funds, because he's delivered on the goods. He gets it. He just needs to deliver those 10 rupee pyjamas and we are all set. And Amit doesn't. Okay. This is what happens with drainage.
The picture is still
I'll get there. So now the cheap commodity, the ladi in stormwater drain maintenance or construction, is clearing silt and debris.
Okay.
Right? Or debris.
Yeah.
So like for every cubic meter of silt and debris that you remove, there's a certain cost associated. You need a JCB, you need the truck, you need all of that. This is the cheap component. The expensive stuff is laying down 1 cubic meter of reinforced cement concrete. Okay. That costs a lot of money. That's what you need to make the walls with, the floor with, and so on. So what they do is, in every tender, there'll be certain units of concrete to be laid and certain units of mud to be taken away. And unit costs are appropriately put. So what they did was they swapped the two around. Okay. Came to the drains, picked up all the dirt, went away with our money.
And the drains never got...
Yeah, none of the reinforced cement concrete came there, or maybe a few units of it did. So what's happened is it's all washed away. And a lot of the times, the funny thing is the mud that gets picked up usually gets deposited next to the drain. Okay, because people don't monitor where it goes.
Yeah.
So it's literally flushed down that drain again. So this is a scam that was alleged to be operating, I think, in the late 2000s.
Okay.
And there are people who have filed cases with the High Court.
Where?
In Bangalore. So this was a scam in Bangalore. One, Mr. L.V. Srirangaraju is an urban planner and expert and a retired civil engineer. So he had shared this anecdote with some of our public policy students a while ago. And I'm happy to share it here.
I'm still mind blown by the way this is working. So what, have the courts ruled anything about it?
As far as I know, the case is still stuck in the courts. It'll take a while. These things don't get wrapped up very quickly. Since then, of course, I don't know what's been happening. I know for a fact that in the last year, some reinforced cement concrete was put into the walls in some parts of the drain, because I can see the stuff that's been constructed next to where I live. But yeah, apart from that, we don't really know.
Okay, I'm still mind blown by this. That was this week's cheat sheet and our roundup of urban flooding. When we come back, we'll sit down with Pranay Kotasthane and Dr Alka Acharya to talk about China.
Hello, I'm Sanjeev.
And I'm Tushar.
And this is the Rotomouth Podcast, a weekly show where we talk about motors and motoring in India. Cars, bikes, rickshaws, buses, friends, familiars, and time pass.
Find us every week on the IVM Podcast app or any other app you might use. Stuck in traffic? Put on Rotomouth. Taking a while in the loo? Rotomouth is there for you.
Dude, that sounded particularly disgusting.
Thank you. But seriously, catch Rotomouth every week.
The Doklam standoff, which has been going on since the 16th of June for 2.5 months, has finally been resolved. Both sides have agreed to withdraw troops on the basis of an agreement that's been arrived at by both sides in backroom talks that have happened.
As the news broke, though, China had a very different spin on it, telling reporters that only Indian troops had retreated, not explicitly saying anything on their troops, though that's not entirely unexpected since the Chinese have had to back off after weeks of sharp rhetoric.
This is kind of funny. India's been inventing various excuses to whitewash its illegal move. But first of all, you've got to make sure your excuses can hold water, dude.
What you just listened to was how the Indian media broke the story of the Doklam border disengagement. The last sound clip you heard was released last month by the Chinese state media on the 7 sins of India. You can't help but notice the difference between the narrative on both sides. India and China have had a tension-filled few months on the border. Relations might normalize as our Prime Minister visits China for the BRICS summit this week. All of this begs the question, how much do we even know about China? The language, the people, the society. What do we know except for stereotypes and casual racism? Even as researchers, our understanding of China is limited.
Hi, welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm back in the studio with fellow Takshashila colleague Pranay Kotasthane and Dr Alka Acharya, who is one of the foremost experts in the field with respect to China. So today, I wanted to ask the both of you a question. What do you think is the fundamental challenge to India in the field of international relations today? Dr. Acharya?
So, actually, I just want to... So we had a discussion at the office, right? And Dr. Acharya was there and she made a very important point. She said that China is the biggest geopolitical challenge for India for the next 30, 40 years. So since she's there, let's know why do you think so, Dr. Acharya?
Well, I would go a little further, not just 20, 30 years, but I think for the next 50 to 70 years, because clearly both these countries are poised to grow in different ways to be important players in the world. And the one striking fact about the position of India and vis-a-vis China is this asymmetry in comprehensive development and power that has started to increase over the past decade and a half. And this asymmetrical positioning where you have China clearly far ahead of you in economic and other, as I said, comprehensive kind of a fashion. So clearly this asymmetry at a point when your relationship is less than ideal, there's a lot of tension in this relationship. China may not be your adversary, but it is certainly a country with an unfriendly country, because you are facing a lot of problems as a consequence of China's activities in and around you, and even there is an unsettled border and a host of other issues. So this increasing asymmetry at a time when your problems with China are still unresolved and there are other challenges that are mounting with the rise of China and China's greater and greater ambitions on the world stage, I think is going to be a problem. How do you handle this situation?
Yeah, and I think there's a big economic aspect to it, right? Like, I remember this Pritchett Summers analysis which was done, and just looking at the economic growth rates of all countries from 1950 onwards, and what they found is there are only 3 countries which have had 6+% growth for continuously for 3 decades. The 3 countries were Taiwan, South Korea, and China. And there's only 1 country which has had 8+% of growth for this longer time. Only 1. And that's China. So I think from that we know what a big power China has become, right? Just 30 years back, probably we were talking about India and China being at the same level. One who might beat the other was probably the question back then. But now I think it's comprehensively answered over the last 30 years, right? So that is one aspect of it. Politically, in what way will that pose challenges to India?
See, the political problem stems from the fact that the relationship between the two countries is still dominated by the overhang of the continuing disputes and tensions. The fact that, we have... it's often said that there is a lack of trust between India and China, which is saying something and not saying anything at all, because I don't think there is any relationship in the world between two countries which does not have an element of distrust or the other. Some element is always there. But the fact is that this distrust is of the order that it is putting up barriers in the way of being able to expand the scope of this relationship in the way it should be between two fast rising powers. China is the biggest economy in the world, second largest in terms of GDP, on its way to surpassing the United States. India is now getting its own growth story into act. I mean, these are the two natural big players, and the economic potential of this relationship is enormous. However, that is unable to transcend the prickliness of the politics. And therefore, the obvious directions which could lead to win-win outcomes are not being met.
Dr. Acharya, if we took, I'm sure this is not possible, but if we took away our historical baggage, then are you saying there would be no challenge of China's rise? Then would China's rise be viewed as peaceful by India?
No, even if, for instance, we did not have, say, the historical baggage, okay, the fact remains that this is still an unequal relationship, that you have a much more powerful country. And I think the challenge stems from the fact that we are not equipped to understand the true extent of this challenge. And this is because we have not invested any resources, human or material, in developing our capacity to understand this country in a comprehensive way. Look at the sad lack of experts studying China in this country. Look at the inability to be able to have the language competence. You were saying something, Pranay?
Yeah, so I think that gets me to the next question. So given that this China is such a big geopolitical challenge, how well equipped are we to meet this challenge? What are we doing in at least countering this challenge, or at least seeing how this challenge looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's not just simply a question of countering the challenge. It's also a question of what are the policies that we are evolving at this stage, what are the kind of ways in which we are interacting, the levels at which we are interacting, the areas which is going to take this relationship to certain desired kind of goals and objectives. And that's what the strategy is about. Where do you want to take this relationship? And clearly at this point, our defenses and our distrust against China are up, way up. We are unable to transcend the fact that China has certain interests in our neighborhood which are working against us. There are all sorts of issues here. But I think the point now is that what kind of choices do we have in terms of addressing this problem?
And you were mentioning that first we need to understand this challenge, right? And you were mentioning how under-equipped we are in terms of Chinese proficiency or understanding China and Chinese studies departments. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think, you see, when we say what goes into policy making, it's not just about, say, people who are involved in the government or official agencies who are just devising their policy. I mean, that's one part of the tactics. But what goes into shaping policy are inputs which come from a certain understanding of, say, the historical evolution of the country, the full complexity of the social, economic, and political issues that prevail in China. I mean, how do you think in terms of China and you 5 years down the road, if you are unable to say what is going to be the trajectory of the social and political or economic kind of challenges within China? There are huge issues within China. How are they likely to impact its own growth story? So what we need to do is study this country with a view to getting an insight into its own development and into its own trajectories. And let's see how we can then factor them into our own policy making. Because making policy in a vacuum or dealing with China purely at a tactical level is really not going to address the need for evolving a longer strategy vis-a-vis China.
Dr. Acharya, I'm just wondering, why do we have this dearth of a knowledge base about China? I mean, don't we have like institutions and people studying China across the country?
I think for a country the size of India and for the kind of challenge that we have in terms of China, I mean, look at this huge country, more than 1 billion people, 26 provinces, different minorities. A good way to understand its complexity is to see how complex we ourselves are. I mean, we also have such a lot of diversity, and China is not a uniformly homogeneous, one-party dominated, automatic, robotic creatures whom, it's transformed over the last 30 years. It's a vibrating, pulsating, contesting kind of a place as well. It's not, so we need to see how China has changed. Where are the kind of possibilities for us to engage with China, open up why we have not done it? Now that's a big question. I think partly it is to do with the fact that there was a war and then suddenly there was a great shock that went across the system. Our universities where international relations is taught is few. So one part of the problem is the larger problem that we do not have so many international relations departments across the country. And the other is the area studies itself. Maybe area studies itself is not developed. But given the importance of China, one would have expected over the last 10, 15 years some investment going into developing the resources, the institutions, the language expertise, and so on. I mean, what kind of a situation are we in when today there is not a single historian of China in this country, a historian who goes back beyond the colonial period? And, how bizarre is that? And our focus is all on the contemporary, the strategic, the foreign policy. We're not studying Chinese society or its culture or its how religion affects people in China, the nature of the regime. I think these are concerns which have to be understood and then filtered into our policy-making process.
In the dearth of this China-specific knowledge in India, we always turn to sources from US or Europe who are actually studying China better. So that also gives us inherent biases because we are coming from their perspective and not ours, right?
Yeah, one problem is that we are not talking to each other directly. Right. Our main sources of understanding or getting ideas about China are English language sources, and they are largely coming from the West. The small area where you have indigenous opinions are in the foreign policy and strategic level. But otherwise, those are simply filters where you are understanding China's behavior in the foreign policy realm. But on other dimensions, we have very little sources. And the problem is compounded by the fact that we are not opening up to the Chinese scholars, to Chinese academics, inviting them here, picking their brains, getting a sense of how they are thinking or discussing vital issues of the day. I mean, there should be a really very, very active exchange of views between Indian and Chinese scholars.
In terms of language, right, as you said, English is the medium. There aren't a lot of places where you can even learn Mandarin in India. I mean, there's a serious dearth of knowledge. And if you can't read Mandarin sources, then you're losing out on a lot of primary source data.
Exactly. We don't know what they are writing or thinking because we are not reading we don't have sufficient human resources who are invested in studying and reading and following the Chinese. Maybe the government has its own agencies which are doing this, but we need to also have a broader understanding about this country at the popular level. So yeah, the surprising thing is that there are no institutions where you can learn the language other than the 3 or 4 in this big country of ours, 3 or 4 universities where this language is taught systematically, or these mushrooming of these small little Mandarin teaching outfits which are geared to essentially tourists or business people who are going there and just need a smattering. So between these two, there is nothing. And I think that's a huge mistake on our part.
So the sense that I get is this overhang of the enemy state and the effect of the 1962 war still continues, and we've sort of maintained our distance, and the government has tried to maintain distance, and that's why it's tough to get scholars here, etc. Which it's mind-boggling now, given that the times have changed, and it's better that, and even if it is an adversary, we should know the adversary better, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. The overhang to the extent that there is a lot of suspicion about what the Chinese scholar will come here to do. I mean, there is so much more study and research on India that is going on in China. I mean, the amazing thing is that you have in Chinese students studying Braj Bhasha and Bhakti poetry and such like things. But we are completely ill-equipped, under-equipped. So partly it is to do with the fact that you are not energizing your channels sufficiently to permit this flow and exchange. The other part of the problem is not enough resources are being spent. See, a larger macro condition is that international relations itself is underfunded, understudied, because India is not yet, now that India is seeking to play a bigger role on the world stage, it will suddenly realize it needs experts of international relations. It needs scholars of different countries. It'll realize. But I would have kept China in a slightly different category because there is a historical connect with China. Shanti Niketan, Tagore set up China Bhavan and this whole intermingling, and that has been going on for centuries. And so the war has really fractured and disrupted a continuity of exchange of ideas and mutual enrichment. And I think that is a very worrisome.
If you see from, let's compare other relationships of India, say India and US. So the relationship between the two societies, the Indian society and the US society, has always sort of been ahead of the relationship of the two states, right? Because there was a lot of business, commerce, people went to study, a lot of exchange of ideas, and sort of that set the tone for what happened politically and at a formal level. Now, I see some sort of that happening with China as well. So a lot of people having business and commerce relationship, and that's why people trying to learn China more. So do you see that causing a change and making people aware that, hey, we should know more about this country which is right next door and which is a big engine of global growth as well?
It will eventually, because it's not possible that this great entrepreneurial energies in this country, which are looking at the opportunity that China provides, is not going to slowly and steadily. And already, if you look at the way in which this two-way movement has started to happen among the economic and commercial sections, it's happening irrespective of the state role, or it's happening despite the problems that the two states have. And that, for me, is, of course, a source of some optimism. But think of how much more dynamic this process would become if the state were to actually facilitate this. And if you look at the economic and the commercial discourse, or even the kind of arguments that are made in the economic commercial fields, and you look at the political, it seems as if they are operating in two different worlds. You talk to the businessmen and they are gung-ho about China. They are not worried about, how China is going to throttle us and control us. And they are saying that this is the opportunity which can actually shape China-India relations into a very different force. So they are seeing economics as an opportunity to change politics. And unfortunately, politics has not yet got into that stride where they say, okay, let us use economics to change politics. So somewhere things are happening of their own volition. Somewhere they are being slowly moved along. But I think it needs now a really strong shake-up, because we cannot afford this kind of a drift, this kind of a literally a stagnation of sorts in the relationship, because the asymmetry with which I started out is going to become a major problem if the relationship is prickly and is unfriendly.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Acharya. So it is indeed a bigger challenge, and given that you said it's going to be a challenge for the next 50 years, Hamsini and I here are learning Mandarin, and I think that money won't go waste because it is likely to come to use for the next 50 years. So thanks a lot for this.
All the best with your Mandarin.
And that's it for this episode of the Pragati Podcast. You can listen to the podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcast from. And of course, on thinkpragati.com.
एक्सक्यूज मी भैया, एक्सक्यूज मी.
बोलिए मैडम.
मेन्यू में क्या है?
मेन्यू में सीन अनसीन है, पॉडकास्ट है, ऑन कोर्स है, साइरस है, मेड इन इंडिया, रीडिस्कवरी प्रोजेक्ट, एम्पावरिंग सीरीज, सेक्स वैक्स है, IVM लाइक्स है, सिंप्लीफाइड है, कीपिंग इट क्वियर है, टिंग्स एंड डेस्टिनेशंस है, माय नेबर जकरबर्ग है और द फैन गराज है. आपको क्या चाहिए?
एक बार रिपीट कर देंगे क्या?
रिपीट नहीं करता हम. आप जाओ IVMpodcast.com पे और सुनो ये सब, या फिर डाउनलोड करो उनका ऐप. सब आपकी उंगलियों पे.